It's been nearly 1 year since George Floyd died while being arrested by police. His death sparked massive protests nationwide and around the world as thousands hit the streets calling for police reform and racial justice. Now, a new project by the Washington Post's editorial board takes a closer look at what it calls an essential truth in this country, that Americans need to reimagine safety, especially when it comes to policing in communities of color where too many people have either died or been harmed while being arrested or in custody. So Molly Roberts is the editorial writer at the Washington Post, and she is a editorial writer, and she's joining me now to talk more about this. So I thought this is just incredibly fascinating. Let us talk first about why this is being called a project. What is the aim of the editorial board? How did it come to fruition?
Well, this summer, after the tragically familiar killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and many other Black Americans, this debate came back into the public conversation, which was, what do we do about reforming police? And I think activists and community members were clearer than ever this time that that conversation is one that we've had over and over, and it isn't really getting us where we need to be. So while reforming police is necessary, we needed to do something a lot bigger, a lot more imaginative, which was ask, if we were starting from scratch, what safety system would we build? And this project is an attempt to answer that question.
But I think it's the right way to approach the challenge. Often we talk about defunding the police, a term that I've said is too misleading. It's too simple. You know, one of the articles in the Washington Post, I call it sort of short form for a host of other things, but I think it's sort of misleading. And even sort of reforming the police is a little misleading. Reimagining safety is really what we're talking about, because what the Washington Post is looking at is the entire safety ecosystem. That's my phrase, the safety ecosystem. Can you talk about how this approach is different than some of the other conversations we've had about defunding the police?
Well, I think it helps to look at public safety a lot like we look at public health. So we look at public health, and I don't think anybody would say that all you need to have for a good public health system is hospitals, right? They could be the best hospitals in the world, and it's not going to be enough. You're going to need good health education. You're going to need parks. You're going to need plenty of other things that have nothing to do with the hospital to keep people from going to the hospital in the first place. And so what if we looked at public safety the same way we looked at public health? I think that's kind of where we started. So we have looking at interventions that are different from having police come in for problems that make up the vast majority of 911 calls. So that could be mental health crises or homelessness. And then also looking at things like environmental interventions. Can we just make neighborhoods look nicer? Can we fix up blighted buildings? Can we create parks? And it turns out that that can make a huge difference and also is a great investment. There's real bang for buck there.
Right, because so many of these things are interconnected. If you have a blighted community where there's an empty lot that is overgrown with trees and bushes, then it's a great hiding place. It's a great place where crime can occur. If you clean it up, it becomes a place of a living space for the community. So, you know, crime's not going to occur there. If you put together a team for homeless intervention so that homeless people don't end up in jail when they're, you know, a nuisance, then you also have to follow up with, you know, better shelters or a plan for long-term living for some of these individuals. And I know there's a lot of people out there that go, oh, this is like this progressive pipe dream. Oh yeah, take money away from the police, give it to a social worker. Well, you know, what's a social worker going to do when someone's having a mental breakdown and he's got a weapon with him? But one of the great things that you point out in one of the articles that came out in the Washington Post is that this stuff is not new. In fact, a lot of police departments have implemented elements of these ideas, and you know that they're already successful.
That's right. We're seeing it on the community level all over the country. Eugene, Oregon has a program, the acronym ends up as CAHOOTS. And essentially what happens there is if there is a crisis, instead of having the police come in, this cahoots team can come in and try to diffuse it. And of course, there can always be a backup to something like this. If it turns out that the person called in to diffuse a crisis isn't able to do it, if it seems like it might get violent, they can always call the police then and bring it in. But right now, really what we have is people have this one answer to a range of problems, which is call 911, have the police department in. And community activists and law enforcement officers agree that we rely too much on police.
Now, that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be reform within policing in this country. And one of the issues that is also brought up by the Washington Post editorial board is the strength of unions and how unions limit accountability. And, you know, part of the argument you make is if there's less dependence on policing to take care of every societal problem, then, you know, the police unions won't be as powerful. But can we talk about the ways in which the police unions, and, you know, they are essential. It's a very dangerous job. But the ways in which police unions can slow progression or change and limit accountability.
I mean, sometimes it has to do with advocating for rules like qualified immunity that make it harder to hold police to account in courts. Sometimes it has to do with just being resistant to that kind of change that you're talking about, the police reform, to body cameras, to all the things that kind of took us here over the course of the years, that there have been huge changes to. You look at somewhere like Camden, New Jersey, where they kind of rebuilt the police force from the ground up. But rebuilding like that, changing the way that a police department does its work, people who work there probably don't want to do that. Change is really, really hard. And so I think by kind of weakening the unions and just making sure that there's a little more room for reinvention within police rather than the broader reinvention that we also want is really important.
In some of your research and stuff, what conclusion or what have you found is the response from communities? We hear defund the police. Do they really want the police defunded? And, you know, what ways have communities sort of pitched in to help make the environment safer for everyone, the police and the people who live in the community?
I think that communities are certainly interested in these changes because it's from communities that we've seen many of them arise, these experiments that we've been talking about. And they've been advocating much earlier than many people on the national stage who kind of only caught up to this summer about how what we've been doing, the conversations we've been having aren't working. So when we talk about projects like changing out vacant lots for parks, or when we talk about projects like focusing on the people most at risk for violence in a community, those are projects that have been largely community-led. And I think it's important to continue that work on the community level and to also get support for that community work on the federal level.
Molly Roberts, we can't even dig into everything. There's a phenomenal article on the Washington Post website called Reimagining Safety. It came out around March 16th, so I encourage people to read it. It's long. Maybe over your Sunday morning coffee or tea is when you want to do it. But thank you so much for joining us this morning, Molly.
Thanks for having me.